Hello all, and this video is going to revolve around Whitehead's metaphysical scheme this time, and we want to be able to decipher out of his metaphysics towards what his conception of God will be in his process theology. And so reality for Whitehead is summarized really in a course of events or occasions. We have to remember now that there's micro and macro biology and the science in the sciences. So you see that sort of influence here where you have the micro, small events of me just talking to you in this video right now, word for word, fleshed out into the span of a 20 to 30 minute lecture. That's just a small example of what he's trying to do, from casting out from the micro to the macro. And I think biology really is the best example you can turn to for that sort of process he's pointing out. The way he describes it with objective data is really sort of the efficient cause, if you will, physical prehension, as it were. You can see that sort of Leibniz terminology there. You remember with Leibniz, it was the acceptance or the awareness of the stimulus or something to the affected, whether you affirmed it and it was a positive stimulus or a negation and you had that sort of deferral. That is how Whitehead would describe objective data, that sort of sensory output. And then you also would turn to his idea of eternal possibilities, which is the logic, if you will, brought to bear by the virtue of objective data. Out of objective data, there was these eternal possibilities within that could have potentially happened, but for whatever reason didn't and wasn't observed in the event. We don't actually invent possibilities, though, even though we recognize them in that sort of logical way. Whether or not we actually can or can't demonstrate it doesn't really matter. These possibilities are definitely out there, and we didn't invent them. And so that's really his recognition of the eternal possibility, which then in turn plays into the eternal object, which is the sort of ideas or logic of that thought in reflection, if you will. And then if you turn to the decision itself, this is what ultimately determines the future. You have that intersection of two different self-reflecting processes, if you will, intersecting into one another, and the results of that are the decision or the event, which leads to the natural course of events. But it's worth recognizing that there's that baseline, if you will, of, I guess age would be a good example of that. Life within us, has that, becoming towards death, and how life, in that sort of fashion actually sustains itself in that sort of Hegelian dialectic tradition. You can kind of see through with Whitehead here. And so if you haven't really picked up on it, he's trying to develop a telos, if you will, out of the subjective, what he calls the subjective aim, that leads to the completion of events. And there is a sort of natural logic or a natural course of events, that sort of baseline, if you will. And on my own here, I wanted to kind of make my own comments and talk a little bit about his Hegelian influence, just because I find it interesting that you look at something like the Hegelian synthesis, the way in which metaphysical schemes, I think, throughout the Western tradition, relies on that same sort of tradition of the Trinitarian of threes, if you will. If anyone's really into numerology, perhaps they can comment on that with metaphysical tripartite systems, if you will. I always find it interesting to try to pin down whether or not they actually point it out. Many of them will actually are rather explicit, whether it's a threefold system or not, or trying to find it. It's interesting to apply that lens always in metaphysical systems, I think. And that's a little side comment I wanted to add on there. But continuing down the laundry list, if you will, satisfaction, as he would call it, is the aesthetic completion of an event. And then you apply the one's feelings that's experienced and unified together. He's taking a sort of utilitarian good towards his teleology of events as they occur. Those small macro, micro events, if you will. On the micro, that sort of looking at the goodness of sensory output, if you will, in that German tradition, where you have good sensation, the aesthetic, the different types of descriptions for what is the aesthetic good. And so God, out of this, is understood in the experience of that self-conscious perception as the lens into God's consciousness. So if you apply that, on that self-conscious basis out towards what his conception of God is, then you're ready to take the step to what is the threefold nature of God with respect to any event that's observed. And so the threefold system that he puts forth can be deduced with his term of the primordial nature. This is what he calls the never-changing ordered harmony of all of the eternal objects or possibilities that we talked about earlier. And what is this really is his he's borrowing, he's taking down that tradition that's been built of the Platonic forms, of course. As Whitehead famously put, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. He's very indebted to Plato with the primordial nature here, with God and the eternal objects, and that sort of structure of what is actually possible within the domain. It's that Platonic form that was passed down through Augustine and so on. And so the next part is the consequent nature, which is really the physical representation that we talked about earlier. The stimulus, the baseline, if you will, that is observable. And then you have the superjective nature, God's selection, if you will, of possibilities to come to flourish in within nature. So God really is the principle, the author, if you will, of concretion, as he put it. And concretion is the growth or the rising of all of these possibilities that are sort of like the ground, if you will, for what is possible. It's a sort of everlasting event on a grand scale of harmony that you can't really have that representation of time causality because it's everlasting. There wasn't a beginning or an end because all possibilities are to be observable within reach. So it makes his metaphysics rather unique because it doesn't have an end. It's everlasting, but it has that orientation towards the Platonic good, the love, if you will, and truth and beauty that he observes within science. Love for him is kind of interesting because it has that sort of Platonic tradition loaded within it of loving the goodness and its orientation towards that sort of ends. When he talks of novel creative experiences, hopefully within this video you had some sort of novelty of learning something or getting something interesting out of it, and it wasn't boring. If it was boring, there isn't that sort of goodness, that satisfaction, if you will. So there is a sort of orientation towards a sort of authorization, if you will, a directive of that from God. And so, obviously, some of the things that are interesting to come out of this sort of panentheism, if you will, is that you can't really have a God that's laden with this sort of personal agency of interacting with the universe, even something, or his creation, even something such as God's will on a personal basis, can't really be judged for that because God has the knowledge of all possibilities within this sort of process. So there is no sort of exclusion of anyone having any sort of divine revelation because it's all wrapped within this sort of process that God has all knowledge of the outcomes, if you will, within potential events. Then he knows even in the acts of evil, which is kind of interesting to look at for Whitehead here, then he can't really act upon it, as it were. And it's also interesting to see in his day as well, with most of this being, if not all, being largely a sort of symbolic story within Christianity or religion in general, and that sort of representation of not actually having this sort of divine revelation, as opposed to philosophical process theology where everything is within these sort of possibilities. There isn't a sort of hidden revelation, if you will, because this can all be understood on a phenomenological basis and then made the leap forward towards these ideas, if you will, these abstractions. But another thing I wanted to actually talk about before I wrap it up on this video in particular is this is going to be a bit off topic, but I think it's fun to play with metaphysics or metaphysical systems here. And one of the things I do find interesting is that these sort of analog baseline of what are, how can you establish, where that baseline is for the potential for possibilities to be arranged in the order as closely orientated towards the good of nature, for example. And what I really mean by that is, of course, in today's world, what does it mean to even say that there is an established baseline, a sort of consensus, if you will, for something like what could be empirically known or observed. We see that sort of denigration, if you will, or even a lack of belief that such truth can even be agreed upon in today's world. So I think it's interesting to see how science as a whole and its mission, or how it's perceived in a Whitehead sense, as compared to what we see now in today's world. But another thing I think is interesting to play with in regards to that sort of baseline, if you will, is, in today's complex or complexified society, trying to find that sort of teleology within those baselines, especially with the praxis of technics, being on this sort of human-to-human basis, if you want to take it in that sort of Marxist tradition, if you will, to where Feuerbach, if you will, says that these are just projections. The religion is the sort of opiate for Marx. These sort of projections of God's ideals. What are the ideals within these technic domains and information dispensers, as we see the control of giant social media, these 3 or 4 websites, as it turns out, is of utmost importance right now. And another perhaps commentary, and why philosophy, I think, is so important as a whole. I think within Whitehead you can see, if I didn't point out to it within the video, we can do that here, and that is, of course, the possibilities eternalized at conception, in that sort of Christian way that is defended in contemporary times with regards to the abortion debate. Those possibilities at conception, that's always been a powerful Christian debate, and I think you can see that within Whitehead's process theology here, the sort of possibilities that can come out from the event of being thrown into the world, if you will, if you want to get Heideggerian about it. But this is just a brief video on Whitehead's conception of God and his metaphysics that he uses to flesh out those conceptions, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it.